Well, again, good morning and welcome to PTS. I'm the Reverend Eric Hooka. I'm the Director of Continuing Education here, and I'm pleased to welcome you in person and those of you who are attending online for the 2024 Albright-Deering Lecture and Conference in Methodist Studies, which is co-sponsored by the Western Pennsylvania Conference of the United Methodist Church. Our theme this year, today, is reclaiming discipleship, and the conversations today are going to energize us and our imagination around youth and young adults in our congregations, communities, and neighborhoods. And those conversations will be led by our two lecturers and conversation partners today that we're excited to have with us. The first is the Reverend Dr. Frederick Edie, Associate Professor of the Practice of Christian Education at Duke Divinity School. And the second, who you'll hear from a little bit this morning and mostly this afternoon, is the Reverend Dr. Reginald Blunt, Murray H. Leifer Associate Professor of Formation, Leadership, and Culture, and the Director of the Church and the Black Experience at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. For more than 25 years, both Dr. Edie and Dr. Blunt have been thinking about the faith formation of young people. And from their respective areas of expertise, they're here today to help us to consider how to reclaim a sense of discipleship in our faith traditions. Before they come up, I invite the president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, the Reverend Dr. Asa J. Lee, to come and welcome you into this sacred space of learning. Is he here? Where did he go? Oh, there he is. Hi.
Good morning. It is indeed my privilege and pleasure to welcome all of you here to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, some of you returning, as I know some of you are alums. I'm excited always to have the Methodists descend and come and participate in the Presbyterian space. Amen. I'm particularly grateful for the work of Eric, who has hit the ground running, just recently appointed to the position, but then quickly started meeting and engaging. And so we are grateful for his ministry among us. It is a good day to be with all of you. As many of you may or may not know, I have a vested interest in the United Methodist Church in the form of the Western Pennsylvania Annual Conference's coordinator for lay and clergy excellence in the form of the Reverend Chenda Ennis Lee, who is someone I know quite intimately. I'm excited that she's here, and it's a very interesting dynamic, because this lecture in particular is a partnership between the seminary and the conference. And so in many respects, it's an embodiment of the partnership that we have on a daily basis between my wife and I. So sometimes, though, we get triangulated because, did you know about this? Did you know about that? But it's great. I'm particularly grateful for Dr. E and Dr. Blunt, who are here with us today to share in their wisdom. Reggie is a very dear friend, and so I'm glad to have him join. You will be wowed by both of their scholarships and the ways in which they will help us, challenge us, and to help us to wrestle with us. Lastly, I want to thank Betty Lou Albright for being with us today. We are grateful for your presence and the ways in which you have and your family have helped to maintain this ministry of the seminary to the church. And so I'm grateful for all of you. And I'm grateful for the Pittsburgh Seminary that continues to live out this commitment to offer to the church expressions of education, growth, and challenge. And so the seminary can do a lot of things, much more than just shape students. But I believe the mission of the ministry of the seminary is to shape the future of the church. And so that is not just through students, but it is also through practicing pastors. And for those who are seeking to learn more about the church, not just pastors, lay folks alike. And so this Albright-Deering is one of the key ways and legacies in which we share our ministry with you. As I say to staff and faculty a lot, there are all these ways that we get to renew our call as a seminary. And this is one of the ways we renew our call. by hearing from you, engaging with you all, but then helping to shape the future of ministry for the body of Christ. So as the preacher reminds us, so that we're not asleep when Jesus calls on us. So glad to be with you all. I will, of course, be in and out throughout the day because being a president means you are running a marathon constantly, and the road has already changed twice today. So I'll be in and out, slipping in and out, but enjoy your day. It's a great day, and glad to be with you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and thanks for being with us today. So the Albright-Deering Lectures in Methodist Studies were established in 1999 through individual contributions and a generous gift from Joseph and Gail Deering of Dayton, Ohio, to celebrate Joseph's career accomplishments and to honor their former pastor, the Reverend Dr. H. Pat Albright. And the lectureship is intended to bring outstanding scholars in the Wesleyan tradition to the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary community. Joseph W. Deering was a graduate of Harvard University and Stanford University and came to Pittsburgh in 1980 as the president of Elger Plumbing Ware. The following year, his family became active in the Mount Lebanon United Methodist Church and thus began a lifelong friendship with the Albrights. Reverend Dr. H. Pat Albright was an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, serving 3 churches in his 38 years of active ministry. First, Wesley United Methodist in Newcastle from 1956 to 64, First United Methodist in Erie from 64 to 78, and then Mount Lebanon United Methodist, where he met the Deerings, from 1978 until his retirement in active ministry in 1994. During his life, Pat also served Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as an adjunct faculty member in homiletics. He also served on the PTS Board of Directors from 1989 to 98, and then as an emeritus member of the board until his death in 2014. And by all accounts, not just from what I've heard here, but from what I've heard from his colleagues here in Western Pennsylvania over the years, by all accounts, Pat was a true Methodist who was passionate about education and about scholarship, but not simply for the sake of acquiring knowledge, but rather for the strengthening of ministry in local churches. And though Pat Albright died in 2014, his wife, Betty Lou, is here with us today, as Dr. Lee pointed out, and so we are glad that you're with us, Betty Lou. And if I can speak a little bit more personally for a minute, some of you in the room know that, like Pat Albright, I am also an ordained United Methodist pastor here in Western Pennsylvania. I too served 3 churches, but not over 38 years, only over 14 years prior to continuing into my work here at PTS. And those of us who are United Methodist clergy and Methodist clergy families, we have a little bit of a sacred bond when we meet each other, and there's a kinship there because maybe we understand, maybe more intimately than others, the life of itinerant ministry, and that in Methodist connections, it's not only that we have to go where God sends us, but we also go where the bishop sends us as well. So, Betty Lou, I just want to let you know that I am very glad that you're here, and I'm glad to be able to make a new friend in you today, and hope that friendship continues. And I just want to let you know that we are so thrilled that you're here to be able to continue to honor the legacy of your husband, as well as legacy of both Joseph and Gail Deering. And on behalf of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Kristen, who's in the back here, is going to bring you this wonderful floral arrangement that was actually made lovingly for you just by a recent PTS alum. So thank you for being with us, Betty Lou. And so what you've come here today for, this morning's lecture, is the Reverend Dr. Frederick Edie, Associate Professor of the Practice of Christian Education at Duke Divinity School, author of book Bath, Table, and Time, Christian Worship as Source and Resource for Youth Ministry, and co-author of Nurturing Faith, a practical theology for educating Christians, which a copy of that second book is actually out there available for purchase this morning for you out in the rotunda. Fred holds a BA degree from Furman University, an MDiv from Vanderbilt, and a PhD from Emory University. Dr. Edie is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He's served congregations on both coasts in youth and educational ministries, and at Duke Divinity, Dr. Edie teaches courses in Christian education, youth ministry, and practical theology. His research interests include exploring the relationships between Christian worship and Christian identity, creating rich context for the formation of Christians, and constructing full-bodied epistemologies. Now, a word about this lecture and its structure. During this lecture, and during this afternoon's as well, Dr. Edie will be inviting us into small group conversations. And so if you're here in the Knox room, you'll be able to do that around your tables. If you are online, you will automatically be placed in breakout rooms for discussion and then brought back into the main room whenever we all come back together. So if you're online, please know that there are no predetermined facilitators for those breakout rooms. And there are also no facilitators predetermined here in this room, but we trust that you'll be able to have good conversation freely with one another anyway. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Fred Edie for this morning's lecture, Corporate Worship, Means of Grace, and the Faith Formation of Youth.
Good morning. My heart's feeling strangely warmed. It's nice to be with brother and sister Wesleyan folks. Perhaps today we can keep this just amongst ourselves. We could rename the room the John Knox Wesley Room, just for the day. So thank you very much to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for this invitation. Thank you to the Albright, and thank you so much for the Albright-Deering lectures that provides a forum to think deeply about ministry. And in a time when Pan-Methodism faces seemingly overwhelming issues of all kinds, for us to actually talk about youth and young adult ministries. I'm deeply grateful for that, for this opportunity, and for the opportunity for us to grow together. I want to share a bit of my background to give you some of my youth ministry bona fides, as we say in the Deep South. I was blessed to grow up in a Methodist congregation that was relatively healthy place and absolutely adored its children and youth, to the extent that young people were always somehow brought to the center of congregational life, welcomed there, nurtured there, and put to work, given opportunities to share their gifts or develop ones they hadn't yet discovered. In the midst of college, that congregation invited me to become a summer youth worker. So there I was, not yet 21 years old, leading the youth group. That's an example of putting gifts to work. And I spent another couple of years there after graduating. After seminary, I felt I could have gone back to South Georgia, but instead went to Southern California. And in Southern California, served a Methodist church, not quite such a healthy place, but still a place that I learned a lot, mostly humility. And as you can imagine, these were two very different cultural contexts. In South Georgia, if I were to meet a young person who for some reason or another wasn't connected with the congregation, I'd say hi, and this person would figure out that I was, engaged in ministry in a congregation, and they would kind of go, well, been meaning to get back to church, Pastor, because there was still in South Georgia at the time kind of the veneer of cultural religiosity. Southern California was very different. And I remember one day I was with one of the young people from our congregation, and we were at a sporting event at the local high school. And this young person, my young person, hooked up with a friend and introduced the friend to me, and the friend looked at me and he said, "My word, are you a Christian?" and I said, yeah, that's what I am. And he said, "Dude, my grandparents used to go to church." And so there wasn't any hint of kind of religious guilt, or just it was like he had discovered in the wild a member of the species that he imagined had long ago gone extinct. You know, he thought you could only see them stuffed in on a wall somewhere, but there I was in the flesh. So that gave me a different set of experience. Again, largely humbling, but useful. I found my way back to the East Coast, determined to try to find a way to deepen ministry, to deepen the young people's discipleship, to work more intentionally on their faith formation. And eventually that sent me to graduate school. And there I discovered this marvelous practice that I had not previously known about, called the catechumenate. Some of you may have heard of this, catechumenate. It was the process of forming disciples toward baptism into the church. It could take as long as 2 or 3 years. Persons didn't just troop down to the altar, or to the front of the church to "just as I am." The first day they showed up. They spent years learning to become Christians. And I just want to name a few of these dynamics. They were invited to live the Christian life with the support of mentoring members. That included missional care for the poor of the community, the widows, the orphans, the wayfaring strangers. It included tending to elderly and infirm members of the church, sometimes taking them the food, including the communion bread and wine left over from Sunday worship. It included disciplines of deconstructing their old sinful selves by way of vigils, fasting, even exorcisms, and of course, constant prayer. It included beginning to learn the scriptures from the elders of the congregation and learning how to interpret them. So this was interesting enough, this ecology of practices. But what I saw so clearly in the literature was that all of these practices were anchored in the primary practice of Christian worship. They were not only anchored there, they were punctuated by rites. These rites included like receiving the creed, writing their names in the book of life, undergoing scrutinies to root out sin, more exorcisms, and all of this culminated with dramatic rites of baptism and First Eucharist, all taking place at Easter dawn. This is powerful stuff. This intentional ecology of formation anchored in and punctuated by equally powerful dramatic worship. Now, some pieces of this were familiar to me. The need for mentorship, the value of service when it comes to faith formation, the kinds of ascetical practices like fasting or vigil keeping, all of those things helping us to sort of extract ourselves from our old selves and prepare ourselves for the new creation. But what was new to me was this notion that worship around the font and then the table was the setting for the emergence of new creation. It was a principal setting for faith formation. There was the perception on the part of the church that this is where God is most powerfully at work to shape Christian disciples in the worshiping space. In 2000, I landed at Duke in 2000, and they were just beginning to think about a youth ministry initiative that would invite high school students to campus for a couple of weeks. And so when I talked to them, I said, well, I'd do a version of the catechumenate here. We would bookend each day with morning and evening prayer. We would center our daily life in word and table worship. Mornings would be devoted to study with our faculty, especially around the sacraments. Afternoons to missional service in the community. Again, that climactic word and table worship in the early evenings. And in this, we didn't practice baptism. Most of the students came to us already baptized, and which was sort of a bummer because, as you hear from Hippolytus in Rome in the midst of the 3rd century, people were baptized naked. It was leave all of the accoutrements of the old world behind you before you step into the font. And I thought that would really generate interest from the adolescent crowd, if we could baptize naked. But that was not to be. So it was instead of a journey to the font, it was framed more as a journey from the font into a kind of journey into baptismal living. We described it as learning to swim in baptismal waters. Okay? Typically, we host about somewhere between 50 and 80 high school juniors and seniors each summer, 25 to 35 adults who were along for the journey. We did this for 20 years until COVID shut us down in 2020. So that's my youth ministry experience in a nutshell. I'm supposed to be operating this, or sorry, I'm having to think about two things at the same time is difficult. So we're not quite there yet. So we'll stay here for a bit. We are here. So this is my, sorry. What did I do, Bobby? I made the PowerPoint slides disappear. Well, I'll go on and I'll count on you to figure that out. Okay, so this is my thesis for the day, and maybe this will be clear already. Corporate worship is a primary zone for faith formation for young people. Corporate worship is a space for making disciples. That's my story, and I'm going to stick to it. So here we go. First, a word about formation. What do I mean by formation? You want me to do this, Bobby? Oh, there we go. Good. So maybe you can see this. If it's okay if you can't. When I talk about formation, I have in mind three things. First, that formation consists in a sense of God's lively presence, God's lively, if mysterious, presence with us. I hope that, plucks some Wesleyan heartstrings with you. This sense of God's lively, if mysterious, presence. Secondly, formation consists in deep in the bones, internalized knowledge of God's identity. And third, formation consists in participation in God's mission. And the first participation in God's mission is a vocation for discipleship. So awareness of God's presence, knowledge of God's identity, and participation in God's mission. That's how I think about formation. And I further suggest that faith arises out of and partly consists in these dynamics. This is how faith is nurtured. And again, worship is a space to participate in these dynamics. All right, now, 3 moves. First, and I'm going to offer these moves and then give you time to talk with one another about them. I want to make some comments, brief comments about young people themselves. Okay? So here's the first one, and maybe this is kind of a truism, but I say kids lead with their hearts. Kids are bubbling cauldrons of passion. Talking about adolescence here. They are at root desiring beings. Maybe we all are too, but it's totally the case with young people. G. Stanley Hall, who was the first to really theorize about a stage in life that we end up calling adolescence, says that adolescence is a season where life glistens and crepitates. It's like through the eyes of teenagers, the world's in 4 dimensions. You know, it's a 5 gig LED TV set with a fantastic surround sound. I mean, it's just fully, vibrantly alive. Kenda Dean, youth ministry scholar at Princeton, puts it this way. She says, the kids are aroused. I just lost his first name. James K.A. Smith, who's a philosophical theologian at Calvin University, says that young people are desiring beings makes them more lovers than thinkers. Okay, so I'm trying to sketch a portrait here. They are lured toward and propelled through life by their desires, loves, passions. And their desire is infinite. Now, I think this also happens to be true about people as old as I am. We have just learned to cover that over with a veneer of reason. But this is my case for kids. And as such, these young people are pursuing ends that they imagine capable of satisfying their limitless passion. They seek to give themselves over completely in love to some other. This other could be a soulmate, maybe a first love. It could be a practice, say a devotion to learning the guitar, or traveling sports, or feminist consciousness raising, or Legos, getting stoned, having sex, this desire to give themselves completely over to something or someone. It's possible that they could give themselves over to Jesus Christ. I think this is a good answer. Jesus remains a good end to give oneself to, maybe even the best end, because only God is capable of meeting this infinite desire of youth with limitless love. Youth's loves can only be fulfilled with and through and in Jesus Christ. All else is going to disappoint. Augustine was correct all those centuries ago when he prayed to God, "My heart is restless until it rests in you, O Lord." But as Kenda Dean Riley observes, where young people are seeking to give their entire being to something worth living for and dying for, they want to give it all in love. What we in the church typically offer is pizza. So kids lead with their hearts and are living to give themselves wholly to some other. We in the church believe that the only worthy end is Jesus Christ. Second, this is very brief, my experience is, and the literature suggests, that young people are not well formed. I know that your particular young people are all, like woebegone kids. They're above average in every way. But in general, not so much. They lack the multimodal means to awaken to God's lively presence. They're largely unaware of God's identity. They seldom are invited to participate in mission for God and God's world. The desires of their hearts attach instead to lesser goods and lesser gods. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and ask you to sorry, Bobby, I'm pushing maybe it's the wrong button. Okay, there we go. So here's a couple of questions. This is where I invite you to gently nudge your neighbor, 2s or 3s. This isn't the right one. Here we go. Where have you witnessed the passion of youth, for good or for ill? Or perhaps where have you longed to witness the passion of youth? It can be in the church, it could be elsewhere. And second, what can you say about Christian formation of youth in your own faith community? Is it poor? Is it, good enough? So those two questions, if you go at it for 3 or 4 minutes, please. All right, I invite you to finish your last bit of conversation and refocus. So, thank you. Thank you for beginning the conversation. I want, perhaps you're bursting to speak out. I want you to hold on to that, and we will have time for conversation or back and forth between us when I conclude. So, the second move I'd like to make are some comments about Christian corporate worship. So I've laid out this portrait, one that I hope you can recognize. We might call it a quasi-theological anthropology, a portrait of what makes human beings tick, especially what makes adolescents tick. And we've said that they're highly aroused creatures in all the multivalent sense of that word. If kids are such, if they're moved to satisfy their heart's desires, and if they are first lovers and only secondarily thinkers, this is a kind of neuroscience thing too, the sense in which young people haven't yet developed the executive function to kind of tamp down what their hearts are compelling them to do. If that's the case, then worship is all the more an essential space for their faith formation. Why? Because worship deliberately activates our hearts. It arouses our joys, our sorrows, our gratitude, our loves, and points all of these affections toward God and God's kingdom. Our hearts are literally lifted up in worship and patterned in relation to God's presence and saving action. Worship is a space that satisfies our desire to give ourselves away by inviting us to perform, to dramatize, to enact this very best version of the good life, Jesus Christ for the world. It's therefore a means of grace, you already knew this, where God's abiding offer of relational love is always on offer, at least potentially. So if young people are led by their hearts, worship is the space where those hearts meet the heart of God. That all sounds really happy and good, and I wish I could quit, but unfortunately, Christian worship isn't the only game in town. And here I'm banking on Christian Smith again. Worship is in fact ubiquitous, but as I said Christian, James K.A. Smith, as he says, the devil has all the good liturgies. And so here are some of his examples. Well, let me say this first. So he paints this picture of these phenomena he calls cultural liturgies, okay? That these are at least implicitly settings for worship, though not even implicitly the worship of the triune God. And so these cultural liturgies are where competing visions of the good life are enacted, and the hearts of young people are directed toward, again, lesser goods, lesser gods. So one of the examples he holds up is major college football. All right? He describes this as a liturgy. That is, it's repetitive. It includes ritual symbols, dramatic performances. It fights for the loyalty of those who participate. I once watched on TV, it was the year after North Carolina won the Final Four, and Michigan State, I think, was second. And the following year, Carolina and Michigan State, Roy, help me, Coach. Thank you, Roy Williams and Tom Izzo. Yes. So there are these two high priests, and this game is staged on the deck of an aircraft carrier in San Francisco Bay. So, and the president was there, Mrs. Obama was there, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were there. So imagine this nexus of military power and entertainment and competitive sports. And all of that, says Smith, is not only is it liturgical, but it's evoking the passions of our hearts and orienting them to certain ends, kinds of tribal loyalty, nationalism, consumerism, entertainment. That's an example of a worship that is stealthily operating on hearts and shaping persons to be disposed in ways that may or may not be Christian. Smith also does this wonderful take on the mall. He lives up there near the mother of all malls, the Mall of Americas, and he describes this as another cultural liturgy where people, the pilgrims come and they ride the tram to the temple, and they get inside, and the aesthetics are transcendent, lofty ceilings, giant trees that grow indoors, lighting, music, and it's all just marvelous. And then they're able to kind of wander into side chapels in this temple, where they make exchanges with priests in each of the chapels, where you offer a card at the altar and you leave with a pair of skinny jeans. And so all of this, says Smith, is actively working on our hearts. training us toward a vision of the good life. In this case, kind of voracious consumers who the mall offers us a vision of salvation, right? But it always leaves us feeling a little unsaved, and therefore the need to return. So that's Christian Smith. And these cultural liturgies have become more elaborate as they've gone online. They're more effective at training our desires. I mean, have you seen TikTok? There are all kinds of cultural liturgies being enacted across TikTok. This, our culture becoming more elaborate and more effective in its liturgizing, while we in the church have sometimes tended to minimize our own. In the name of comfort, comfort and maybe outreach, we have, and not wanting to scare anybody off, we have given up on the worship of bizarre language and strange rites. We instead have established a kind of aesthetic in some of our congregations that feel like the Ellen show. Everybody's comfortable and welcome, and before the day's out, we might get to dance. Sorry, lost my place a bit. So, if worship is deeply formational through its capacity to evoke this vision of the kingdom, whether Christian or not, maybe we Christians, instead of retreating from our ritual life, ought to double down on it, to embrace it. We might think we might start thinking again about processing our cross around the sanctuary during Holy Week, or maybe around the neighborhood. We might return to confessing sin and fear and trembling on our knees. We might have a hug fest in sharing Christ's peace with one another. We might consider again greeting Easter dawn with baptisms or baptismal renewal and maybe dancing to boot. We might come to the table as if it were a lavish feast. We might baptize in a fashion that brings folks very close to drowning and uncomfortably close to birthing. We might sing in such a way like the Who's in Whoville that we cause Grinchy folks' hearts to grow 3 sizes in a single day. Altogether, we might consider performing our story at full stretch through extravagant ritual symbols if we want young people to imagine God's kingdom and to have their hearts disposed to seek it. Okay, so went the wrong way again. I'd like you to think about the faith community that you're most engaged with. And these are the questions. How does your community's worship compare and contrast with other cultural liturgies? Is it radically different, in some ways the same, in some ways too closely resembling other cultural liturgies? And second, is your congregation's worship powerful enough to become a kind of counter-liturgy that stands in contrast to other cultural liturgies, that might then have the imaginative power to reorient young desire? Okay? Go at that for 4 or 5 minutes. Okay. So we've made 2 moves. One is this portrait of adolescence, suggesting that young people are led by their hearts, their deeply desire to give themselves totally over to someone, something, some cause, some triune God who can meet those loves? And then if that's the case, if young people are lovers, then worship, I suggested, is the space for them to be formed, because worship evokes and orients our lives toward, Christian worship at least, toward the kingdom of God. Now, if I were just a theologian from an ivory tower, I would end with a rhetorical flourish and we'd all be inspired, but I'm not. I'm a practical theologian. So what I want to do is propose to you, like if this sort of registers, like, yeah, I do think kids are passionate human beings, and I do think worship is a space for evoking passion. So what might we do to make that into a more formative ecology? And so I don't know how well you can see this. Feel free to get up if you need to. Well, I won't risk it. I'll just tell you what's here. So at the center, I've put corporate worship at full stretch. And by that, let me just say a few words about it. At full stretch, meaning that we don't apologize for our strange Christian doings, our odd symbols, our funny language. We double down on it. We make our baptismal font large, splashy. We imagine or set up our Eucharistic table as a feast. We say great prayers over it. We might, well, I'll say that in a moment. So, yeah, okay. So this, presuming that this is at the center, corporate worship at full stretch. And so then we move, these all are sort of interconnected. This here says youth practice servant leadership around the table. I'm thinking just about the table now, not the whole of worship. So youth are invited to practice servant leadership around this table. That is, acolytes, perhaps, are trained not just to stand there, but to actively assist in the preparation of the table, in the overseeing of the needs of the presiding elder as the elements are shared, in any way that is helpful. They are also perhaps trained to become lay Eucharistic ministers. That is, people who, why not youth, who share the bread and the cup with people who come to receive it. Youth might lead the congregational sung responses in the great prayer of thanksgiving. There are all kinds of musical settings within this prayer in the people's responses. You lift up your hearts, we lift them up to the Lord. There are contemporary worship responses. There are folk mass with guitar responses. There are gospel feeling responses. So these are accessible to young people. Why not invite them to lead them? And then, in addition, once again, lost my place. Yeah. Okay. So. Music. Oh, so to comment on this, this puts kids where the action is, liturgically speaking. This is the zone where you get to encounter God in the presence of the crucified and resurrected Christ by the power of the Spirit. Over and over at the Youth Academy that was 20 years at Duke, what we heard from young people, how formative and even transformative this experience was. This experience of, assisting at the table, of sharing the elements. They had this sense of that they were so intimately close to God's powerful, active presence. They felt like they were mediators of grace. Some of them had never been asked before to do anything like this. And it was profound. They couldn't stop talking about it. And, from just a practical standpoint, leadership, this kind of leadership also promoted ownership. This sacrament that they, may or may not have cared about at all, a kind of anachronistic, old-fashioned liturgy that didn't grab them. Doing this leadership in front of God and everybody tended to make them care a lot more. They didn't want to be embarrassed, for one thing, but then again, there's this possibility of proximity to divine action. We would occasionally say to them afterward in a kind of informal reflection, how was this leadership like or unlike what you were expecting? How did you sense God's presence to you and to others here at the table? What was your sense of God, what God was doing at the table? So there was this move of preparing young people to assist, their participation, their assisting, and then reflecting upon it. So youth practice servant leadership around the table. Another move, I see my time is waning. I say youth practice missional liturgies of life linked to the table. Liturgies of living linked to the table. And by this I mean, when I was newly ordained in my ministry, my last pastoral ministry context, I looked for opportunities where it made sense, where it made formative sense to offer Holy Communion to young people. So we, annually we would do a canned food drive around our local community. And kids would come back with boatloads of cans, and we would just set up a table, stack a few cans, and lay out bread and cup. And here's another one. At the Youth Academy, we regularly went gleaning. You know that through the Society of St. Andrew, it's possible to go and harvest vegetables, fruits. One year, the first year we did this, the gleaning was of cantaloupe. And this was when cantaloupe, so tossing melons, you'd toss them down through the rows and to go into a pickup truck, and that became like an officially sanctioned practice of the good life. And so we loved it, the kids loved it. While we were there, completely unexpected, a group of migrant workers descended from trailers on the hill, started up in a field adjacent to ours, and did the job with 10 folks that we had done with 100 better and more quickly than we did it, and then retreated back to their trailer on a hill. And when it was all done, we put cantaloupe on it, some crates, laid out bread and cup. The preaching was on passages from Ruth about gleaning, about the food system, about justice, and people ate the meal. So what I'm suggesting here are there are practices and places and times that you can juxtapose this sacrament to ways of living that illuminate both the sacrament and these ways of living. There's a kind of imaginative linking made possible so that not only is God pleased and God worshiped, but young people have more touchstones. They can look at the table and say, oh yeah, the table's about justice. The table's about feeding the hungry, etc., etc. Okay. This says teaching and reflection on the table across multiple settings. So there are 1,000,001 ways for you to imagine teaching, a kind of catechetical teaching about the Lord's table. It could be focused on scriptures having to do with feasting and fasting. It could focus on the bread and the cup and how to imagine bread, not just as dough and water and a little yeast that gets heated up, but bread as companionship, bread as the fruit of creation, bread as sustenance. So the wider and more expansive imaginations become around these symbols, the more possible links there are to Christian faith and life. And I'm just going to skip to the last bit. Another important piece in this ecology, accompaniment by mentors who themselves hunger for the table. That is, folks who have awakened to the fact that the need to live on not just bread, but bread of life, and find it there at the table. And young people, we all need mentors. And for young people to see adults, faithful adults, making that practice central and important piece of their lives is powerfully formative in its own right. One more time, all of this is a kind of formational ecology. Vibrant worship, table-adjacent practices, teaching repeatedly on multiple dimensions of the meal, all in the presence of mentors. And that's a way, I think, that worship becomes even more formative space. A central location for disciple making. All right, thank you. Sorry, I left you hanging. So I'm done. You have to tell us, Eric, whether we have time for questions or what.
That's what I came up to do, to tell you whether you have time for questions. We have time probably for one or two right now. I will tell you, though, that we have time set aside at 3 o'clock for additional questions for the whole day. So we have time for one or two kind of lightning round questions here for Fred. Are there any online as of yet? Is there anybody in the room that has a question you'd like to lift up, and I can come with the microphone to you?
Thank you. When we were talking about the devil has all the good liturgies, we added excursions to the Rocky Horror Picture Show on that list. But you had the mall and you had football, and all three of those are marked by violence in one way or another. I mean, going to the mall, if you have a addiction to shopping and credit card debt, that's lethal. And we also sort of allied over that when we think about the basis of our faith is a crucified Christ who's resurrected. So there's violence even in our own faith. I'm just interested in your comments.
Well, you're right and not to mention, with respect to the mall, not to mention the kind of exploitative labor practices that made these jeans show up on a rack. I mean, people were working pittance wages so that we could make this religious exchange. Yeah, so I guess I would narrate the violence of Jesus' death in relation to the nonviolence of his messianic witness. Jesus, I would be inclined to follow some Mennonite thinking here around Jesus, that somehow his sacrifice, through his sacrifice, God intended to end sacrifices of violence. That there is no more need for human beings to sacrifice one another violently because Jesus has taken that upon himself. But that, that takes some narrating. I will say that what then is imperative for us when we celebrate, say, at the Lord's table, is that we not only witness to Jesus' sacrificial death. And my experience growing up was that Holy Communion was a time of penitence for our unworthiness to eat this food. The pastor actually knelt on the altar rail with his back to the rest of the congregation and kind of mumbled, "We are not worthy so much as to eat crumbs from beneath your table." And so there was that as the sole emphasis, instead of and not including the kind of resurrected presence that Jesus is also alive, and that this weight of sin is lifted.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there, and thank you, Fred, for sharing your wisdom with us.